why am I being asked this? Or I can't deal with all these questions.
I see this play out quite a bit with my kids because it's very easy to give your kids information and feel like it's going in one ear and out the other.
If I'm trying to communicate something to you, but you don't understand it, you can't execute.
Even when we have good intent, and then when that intent is misconstrued, we get frustrated.
It's really theory versus reality.
What that requires if we want to be effective communicators is actually thinking about So for this episode, I've been thinking a lot about communication and how we communicate with the people around us and how frustrating it can be when we feel like we're communicating and we're simple, we're clear, we're concise, we're giving a good message, and yet the people around us aren't doing what we're asking them to do. And a lot of it, I think, comes back to our intent. We have the best of intent, and then we're frustrated when things get missed in translation. So that's what we're talking about today, communication. How do we better communicate with the people around us so that they understand what our real intent is?
Yeah, I think intent doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't really matter what your intent is. It's if I'm trying to communicate something to you, but you don't understand it, you can't execute. And if I'm trying to be indirect and I'm trying to say something that's constructive, but you take it in a very defensive way, then I came at you too hard. I was too direct. And so that's what actually matters. It's really theory versus reality. And so oftentimes I think we try to operate in theory and justify things that we do. Well, hey, if you got offended by something I've said, well, I'm sorry that you got offended. That's actually, it's not even a real apology. It's certainly not ownership, right? It's if you got offended by something I said, then clearly I didn't communicate it well. I didn't clarify it well. I even if I saw that maybe you reacted in a way, I didn't follow up with you to say, hey, Jamie, did you take something the wrong way? Because that's certainly not what I meant. So I think that the intent doesn't actually really matter. What matters is reality, right? And this goes back to our company, Echelon Front. Echelon Front, Jocko and I went round and round and round about this, what the name would be. And we finally landed on Echelon Front because we learned these principles on the battlefield. And so Echelon is an organized unit and Front is the forward line of battle. And so we wanted to indicate, right, with the very name of our leadership consulting business, that this was not some deep theory learned in a classroom. It's actually practical, actionable things that you can take and implement in reality, not in theory, but in reality. And I think it's the same thing for communication. It doesn't matter how well I think I've communicated. What actually matters is that you understand.
Yeah, and what happens so often is we don't think about the way we're communicating something, even when we have good intent. And then when that intent is misconstrued, we get frustrated because people's perception now becomes their truth. And so now we're in a situation where they misconstrued our intent despite our best efforts, and there's friction there. One of the things we started doing as a way to help people realize this, we did this at the first Women's Assembly. We printed off an email, same words, same email. And in this activity, I would read it with a positive tone, really good intent. I have good intent. I want to communicate this thing to this other individual. And then Meg, who was on stage with me at the time, read it in the way she might receive it. If we don't have a great relationship, she read it in this negative tone. The same words, the same message, two very different meanings based on how someone is perceiving that message coming through. So it's so much more on us as leaders to think about the way we're communicating, and yet too often we put the responsibility for how someone receives that message on them. Hey, if you get offended, I'm sorry you got offended for that. We're putting the responsibility on them instead of recognizing what can we do to simplify that communication and ensure that our intent, our true intent, is coming through.
And one of the things that I hear leadership consultants or speakers talk about is authenticity. You have to be authentic. And that's true. You don't want to pretend to be somebody you're not, right? If I'm pretending to be somebody I'm not, that's not going to be effective. But you can take that to justify, well, that's just how I just tell it like it is. I'm just an honest person. If I've got some feedback for you, Jamie, I'm trying to do that in a constructive manner. But I'm like, Jamie, that was terrible. You screwed that up. And you're going to get defensive. You're going to push back on that. So if my goal is for you to accept the feedback that I'm giving you and try to get better, I'm actually going the opposite direction. So you can't let that authenticity justify your behavior of being, brutally honest with people, because that doesn't work. You have to do what's effective.
And what we can do as leaders is control to the best of our abilities the intent that we're trying to construe. So we have a framework: tone, tact, timing, and delivery. The tone piece is always, for me, the most critical. And I see this most with my teenager. So he's 16 and he'll be upstairs and I'll yell for him to come downstairs and I won't get a response. So my tone changes a little bit. And I'll yell a little bit louder just to get him to hear me. It's really just more a volume thing, less of me being frustrated. It's more like, hey, Nico, I need you to come downstairs. And by the third time, what I get in response from my teenager is a quick defensive reaction. What? I'm coming. I hear you. He is assuming the tone that I have. I'm not frustrated. I'm not angry. I'm leveling up my volume just so he can hear me. But the way that he hears it is now his perception. His perception is truth. Mom's angry. She's yelling at me. And really, I'm just trying to get his attention to get him to come downstairs. So that tone piece is so critical, and how we try our best to manage the tone in the way we're communicating with other people is so critical as the first starting point for communicating effectively.
I think that's definitely a huge piece. And in order to do that effectively, you have to consider the perspective of the person that you're communicating with. And that's a hard thing for us because we all kind of see the world through our own lens, our own perspectives. It's hard to see from other people's perspectives. And if you could see, like, what's my teenager thinking about? What's he, how's he going to take things? What's my team thinking about? What's my spouse thinking about? What's this other person that I've had a frictional relationship that maybe, there's an ego issue involved here. How are they going to take something that I say or do? And I think that enables you to more effectively communicate. I think particularly with the written word, you have to be extremely careful. And you just mentioned that. I love that exercise that you and Meg do at the Women's Assembly, because oftentimes we put something down and we attend it one way in an email or a text message, but it can be interpreted radically different. And having someone else look at it, someone else read it, makes all the difference in the world. And I found when I was in the SEAL teams, my last deployment, a combat deployment to Iraq, and we had units that were scattered over the entire Western Euphrates River Valley. So I've got a dozen different locations, and so we'd send out emails to people, and I realized you'd start to see some frictions building up with some of these remote locations that I couldn't have face-to-face conversations with, and trading emails back and forth. Things are starting to escalate. People are frustrated. People are, frustrations could even be starting to brim over. And the moment that I would just simply pick up the phone and call them and talk to them, all of that is resolved in a 2-minute phone call. So you have to be really careful, I think, about what's in an email. And something that you do great, I think, at Echelon Front, where if you're about to send an email out, you're like, hey, read this email. What does that sound like? And so you'll send it to me, or you send it to Dave or Jocko, or whoever the team, so that we can think about what it's going to be interpreted like to everyone else. I think getting someone else's perspective on your communication is really important.
Yeah, you mentioned something really important in this communication conversation, which is understanding who you're talking to and adjusting the way we communicate with different people in our lives based on their preferred communication method. So again, as leaders, what we often do is we put out word and we communicate in the way that's most comfortable for us. And we leave it up to everyone else to translate that message and to receive it in the way that we intend, with the right tone, with the right messaging, and to understand what we're asking them to do. And in reality, what that requires, if we want to be effective communicators, is actually thinking about, how does Leif communicate? How does Jocko communicate? How does this other member of my team or my teenager or my spouse, what's their preferred method? I've used you and Jocko oftentimes as examples because Jocko is kind of bullet points. And I've learned that in order to be effective with him, I have to communicate quickly. He's busy, he's on the go, and he doesn't need a lot of information. So I can give him quick bullet points and we can get through something quickly. I learned early on with you need a little more information, and I want to have a little more time. You are, we joke about the Southern hospitality, but you're going to stop and ask me how my life is going and how my kids are going, and I need a little more time with you. So planning that in and how we communicate with the different people around us is what's going to enable us to be most effective. Thinking about how can we communicate with this person that is specific to them allows us to better manage some of those miscommunication with tone and tact and our intent.
I think that's a great point. And oftentimes some of the most frustrations that build, in the work environment is with the boss asking questions about things. You feel like you're being micromanaged and, why am I being asked this? Or why can't I just be allowed to run with things? Or, hey, I can't deal with all these questions. Can't they just trust me and let me do my job? And I think when you can think about what your boss is thinking, the perspective of what is the risk that your boss is concerned about? What is the information that your boss actually needs? And I think those are great examples of where it seems like an impossible problem, right? If you're being micromanaged, you're being scrutinized, but it's actually a super easy thing to solve simply by, the boss needs this information. The boss is concerned about this particular risk. Let me actually push some information, and you will see, we've seen so many turnarounds that happen where someone that feels frustrated applies these principles of leadership, takes extreme ownership of that problem, pushes more information up the chain of command, communicates a little bit more effectively once they recognize the perspective of the person they're trying to communicate with and gets that problem solved.
So let's go back to this framework. Tone, tact, delivery, and timing. So we talked a little bit about tone, how critical it is for us to manage our tone and to think about the way that our tone might be perceived. Tact is the words we use. And you mentioned, hey, one of the best things we can do is to have other people look at those pieces of communication and give us feedback. That's a great way to get feedback on the tact, the words that we're using. The delivery, you had mentioned, hey, sometimes this isn't an email. Sometimes the email and text messaging is not the best way. It's not the best way to deliver this message. Maybe that's a phone call. Maybe that's a face-to-face. Maybe it's hopping on Zoom, having that face-to-face conversation where we can better control our intent and our facial features and make sure that message is clear. And then a really critical part is timing. So what does that play into as we think about communicating with others, the timing of when we communicate?
Timing is a huge one because we all tend to think that whatever we're doing is the most important thing in the entire world. And I think that's just kind of our natural human tendency. We're focused on what we have to do, what we have to get done. And it's hard for us to kind of see outside of that. I see that with my kids. They try to come up and they interrupt a conversation that I'm having when what they're asking me about is really not very important at all. And they could sit there and wait for another 30 or 45 seconds for me to finish talking before they interrupt. And so I'm having to teach them to think about this timing. But we all have that as adults as well. And so if I've got something to do, and it's in my head, I might reach out to you and say, hey, Jamie, can we get this done? You might be taking care of something that's way more important than what I wanted you to focus on or do. But I'm not thinking about that. I'm not thinking about the timing of that. So we see this all the time with the leaders we work with. And there was one particular one who was really frustrated. This was a guy who was going in and selling some commercial insurance products to a high-powered CEO running a very successful company. And he was frustrated that the CEO wouldn't give him the 45 minutes or an hour that he actually allotted or he wanted to have. And so we said, well, how long do you get? He said, well, I get 10 or 15 minutes. And then we said, well, maybe that's all that this person has. Think about what that person's dealing with. Think about this is a CEO. He's running a billion-dollar corporation. He's got a lot going on. There may be things that are a way higher priority that he's dealing with. Very likely there are things that are way higher priority, what he's dealing with and what you're trying to tell him about. So take whatever you have to say and condense it into the 10 minutes that you have. And maybe it doesn't even take that long. And I think you've done a great job of that, condensing it down to bullet points to focus on those things that matter. And you got to consider that. Consider the timing when you're bringing something to someone. Hey, you didn't get a response to your email. Cool. Did you send it to them at 5:45 p.m. on a Friday afternoon? They probably haven't even seen it yet, right? It's been stacked up with all the other emails they got over the weekend. So consider timing. It's a really important thing in whether or not you've communicated effectively.
Yeah, and it's something people miss a lot. I always use the example with a husband and wife who are having a conversation and maybe they have to make a big decision or they're having a little bit of an argument. And maybe the best time to have that conversation isn't at 10:30 at night when you're both tired and you've had a long day. Those are the moments where you have to say, okay, I need to detach for a minute and figure out what is going to have the biggest impact on this conversation. What's going to allow me to communicate effectively and actually get this problem resolved? I have to think about the timing and the way I communicate. The tone, the tact, how we deliver, all that's really important. But the last piece of that is thinking about the time in which we try to engage in these conversations.
It's a huge one to consider because at the end of the day, for communication, there's only two measures that matter: effective and ineffective. And if you pick the wrong time, right? If you're dealing with an immediate fire and something that's going on, and I'm trying to address some big strategic concern that I have, you're probably not even paying attention to what's going on because I got a timeline to meet. Can Leif just get out of my office, or can we get off the phone so I can actually get this done? Because if I don't meet this timeline, there's some real consequences for them. Yeah,
one of my favorite tools that we teach at Echelon Front, which I think helps to mitigate some of these mishaps in the way we communicate with one another is the Readback. And I love this tool. I use it all the time. I use it with my kids. I use it with my team. I use it with you guys as you guys put out information, because this tool allows us to, hey, if we do all the things right, we try to manage our tone, we think about the words we're using in our tact, we deliver this message effectively, and we think about the timing, and we've done all those components right, there's still the potential that our team doesn't quite understand the plan, that we're not simple enough, that we haven't communicated in a way that allows them to go and execute. So the Readback becomes our tool for how we test ourselves and how we make sure that we've communicated effectively with our team. So do you want to explain what the Readback is?
The Readback comes from radio transmissions where, if I'm on a different place on the battlefield from someone else that I'm talking to that might be miles away and I can't actually see them, and if I'm passing traffic to them over the radio, I'm giving them some direction, they're going to read back what they heard. So I know that they understood what I'm actually telling them and it wasn't some broken transmission. And so how we use that is that it's a test for whether or not you've communicated effectively. If I'm a SEAL platoon commander and I'm giving a mission brief, what we call an operation order before we launch on a combat operation, then I can say, hey, are there any questions? There's generally no questions.
No one's asking a question.
People generally don't raise their hand to ask questions. Or I could say, do you understand? Most people are going to nod or not say anything. So those things don't tell you anything. But if I actually ask someone in the front row to say, okay, hey, talk me back through the escape and evasion plan. What happens if you find yourself out on the battlefield and you're all by yourself? How are you going to communicate? What nets are you going to monitor? What are your link up points? How are you going to signal? Then I know that they understood it or they didn't understand it. And it's not a test for whether or not they're paying attention. The test is whether or not I communicated effectively. Because if they don't understand it, I know that there's probably a bunch of other guys in the room that don't understand it as well. And so now I know I need to revisit that because I just bombarded them with a whole bunch of information. And we need to go through that again so I make sure that they understand. Because when people don't understand, they can't execute.
What you said right there is the key to the Readback. It's a test for you. And too often we assign the responsibility of the people at the other end of this communication to understand the plan and understand what we're trying to say. The Readback allows us to test ourselves. When I ask my team for a Readback, I'm asking them because I want to make sure I didn't miss anything in the way that I communicated. When I'm giving you a Readback, when you put out word and you give me information and I'm saying, hey, Leif, can I give you a Readback? Again, it's a test for me. Hey, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking of me. I see this play out quite a bit with my kids because it's very easy to give your kids information and feel like it's going in one ear and out the other. And I use the Readback often because it's a great way to ensure alignment and ensure that we are moving in the same direction. And I think the best example I have of the Readback is when I didn't use it and it cost me. So my youngest daughter, I had asked her to go and load the dishwasher and I didn't get the Readback. This is a simple task. I didn't think I needed the Readback. I didn't ask for it. She runs off to do the task. Hour later, come back in, there's still dishes in the sink. And I'm like, hey, Charlie, I asked you to load the dishwasher. And she's like, you said unload the dishwasher. And it took me like a split second to realize she had taken all of the dirty dishes in our dishwasher and put them in various cabinets and drawers throughout our house. So my initial frustration is, man, that's not what I said, because that's what we do as leaders, right? That's not what I said. I didn't communicate that way. But because I teach these principles, I had to take that step back and say, okay, there's a potential I said it wrong. And second of all, it's still my fault because I didn't ask for the Readback. It would have taken 2 seconds to say, hey, give me a Readback. And we would have aligned and I would have said, no, I want you to load the dishwasher. And we could have avoided this mishaps. And this is a small example, certainly not the example you're giving with giving, a SEAL mission and giving that brief on a big mission on the battlefield, but it's the same principle that applies. We communicate in the best way that we can, and then we use the Readback to ensure we're communicating effectively and that we're aligned on the mission, and we can mitigate some of that frustration when our team runs off and does something that we didn't ask them to do. That's always comes back to us as the leader. What are we communicating? How are we communicating? And are we getting that opportunity to test ourselves and ensure that we're aligned?
I think what's so hard about this too is that we all think we do it well. Like we all assume that we're the greatest communicators ever. It probably never even crossed your mind, right? That your daughter may misinterpret what you say and do the opposite. Because in your mind, it was super clear. And that's, I think where considering other people's perspectives really matters. As a SEAL leader, I would be intimately involved in the intelligence analysis, in the mission planning. So I might have been looking at a target for maybe hours at the very minimum. Sometimes for the bigger combat operations we were part of, it might be days or even weeks that we're planning these operations. I've got guys showing up to the brief who don't have any of that insight. And so I'm trying to bombard them with a bunch of information over the course of 45 minutes or an hour. Well, they're only going to process so much of that information, and they're not going to understand the way I have if I've been really looking at this data. So it really requires you to think about what your people are thinking. And obviously this happens not just on the battlefield, right? But in the business world as well. One particular company, we went in to sit down with this company, and we were at their headquarters, at their corporate headquarters, and they had this beautiful mission, vision, value statement. It was all over the wall, these big banners. They'd written it up, and they were super proud of it. They talked us through how this was important. I thought, oh, this is great. And the question I asked them is, how well do you think your frontline troops actually understand this? And the executive team, to a person, was like, they absolutely understand it. We live by this. We breathe by this. This is awesome. And this is how we're really going to steer ourselves, to success and go accomplish our mission and win. This is how they were going to lead and win, was their mission, vision, value statement. So we walked out and just pulled a few frontline leaders and talked to some of their frontline troops, some of their individual contributors. I was like, hey, talk to me about your mission, vision, value statement. And they said, what are you talking about? I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. So they weren't familiar with it. They didn't understand it. And even though the leadership had spent a lot of time and effort, and they'd sent it out over email and they put it on banners up on the wall, they had not used a readback to make sure that it was understood. And I think this is just an example of, they thought they were communicating well, but they realized after a little bit of a readback and some feedback on the fact that their communication had been ineffective, they had to do a better job of making sure that the frontline troops understood.
Yeah, and something else to consider in all of this, because relationships comes up in so much of what we teach at Echelon Front, the power of relationships. It's why it's the first, law of combat, as we call it, the power of relationships, working together as a team. How important is it to have strong relationships? How important is relationships related to communication and how we effectively communicate with one another?
It makes all the difference in the world, because if you and I have a good relationship and you say something that doesn't make sense to me, then I'm going to ask for clarification. I'm going to feel more comfortable saying, hey, Jamie, what did you mean by that? Hey, let me understand what your intent is here. And this enables us to effectively communicate. Because again, if I don't understand, I can't go execute. And it's the same thing. If I say something, but you're like, I don't really understand what Leif was saying, you're much more inclined to reach out to me. Relationships are super important into effective communication, because if you and I have a good relationship, then you're much more inclined to ask me for some clarification. I understand how it is that you communicate and what it is that you need, and maybe where you might need some more clarification, where I can simplify things. So relationships are very important in how we communicate as well, because the stronger relationship, the more we want each other to succeed, the more aligned that we are, the easier it is for us to be able to reach out to each other to ask for some clarification. Yeah,
we're much more inclined to assume good intent if we have a good relationship. But like we've done in other episodes, I always warn people, don't overestimate that. We always assume our relationships are stronger than they are. And I see you and Jocko do this well. You might respond to me in a text because of our longstanding history in our relationship. A one-word answer, check, roger that, execute. But with other team members or newer team members, you're going to take a little more time and give them a little more feedback and write something out and think about that relationship. We're in the middle of building this relationship. We need to be more intentional in the way we communicate. That's where the tone, tact, timing, delivery comes into play, and the recognition that your intent really means nothing. It's how the other person on the receiving end is receiving that message. And focusing on building a relationship from the get-go helps us to improve upon our communication ability over time.
And you're not going to know that to improve if you don't use that readback. That's why the readback is so important. And I think oftentimes with the readback, using a different medium. Like if we're coming out of a meeting, you'll send me an email that says, all right, I'm focused on these 3 things as the priority, A, B, and C. I just want to make sure that aligns with what we talked about. If we put out a bunch of things, that's a great way to do that. The real mistake that I see a lot of people make is they just send an email and then they think communication happened and everyone understood, exactly what I indicated in the email. And oftentimes we have a tendency to over communicate, which is why we have the second law of combat is simple. We have to simplify things and communicate in a manner that's simple, clear, concise. And I won't understand if you got what you needed to out of the email if I don't just pick up the phone and call. If it's an important enough thing that I need to make sure it was effectively communicated, then I should follow up that email with a quick phone call just to make sure that you understand that if there are any questions, I can clarify, commander's intent, the purpose, the goal, the end state that we're trying to achieve.
Exactly. The readback is one of the most practical tools we teach. When combined with the debrief, which we talked about on the last episode, the readback can be a really great way to ensure alignment and help to mitigate those communication misfires when we're trying to get our team aligned on what we're trying to do to accomplish the mission. So we have to implement the readback. It is a very simple thing. It's easy to do. I do it at home with my kids. I do it with my husband. I do it with my team. So the immediate action drill for this episode is to start implementing the readback. And remember, it's a test for you. When you're implementing this readback, it's not about, hey, I want to make sure you understood what I said. That puts people on the defense. I want to make sure I communicated effectively and didn't miss anything of importance. So start using the readback when you're giving information to the people around you. Use the readback when you're getting information from other people, and then use those other ways of implementing the readback by following up in an email, picking up the phone, doing some follow-up to ensure that we're aligned. All those different ways we can implement the readback will help us to ensure alignment with our team and that we're going to be moving in the right direction, and we can help to avoid some of these miscommunications that happen when we assume good intent and it's perceived in a different way.
The readback is one of the most practical tools that you could implement that will absolutely improve your communication. You will understand whether or not it's effective or ineffective, and you can make adjustments. If you use that readback, you will communicate more effectively, and that will enable you to lead and win.
Find us on YouTube or wherever you like to listen to podcasts, and do all the things you're supposed to do. Like, subscribe, share, leave us a review, but most importantly, send us the leadership challenges that you're facing right now so we can target our next episodes to helping you understand how to apply the principles of extreme ownership to solving those challenges.
Check out our free resources at echelonfront.com, or you can take the next step and join the Extreme Ownership Academy, our online training platform, where we go deeper on these principles and teach you how to apply them in your business and in your life.